كما استخلف الذين من قبلهم. It is a promise of Allah to those who believe among you and do righteous deeds that Allah will grant you succession in the land. So the term caliphate comes from the Arabic term khilafa, and the word khilafa comes from the Arabic root word khalafa. Khalafa means to leave behind, right? So technically speaking, in Islam, in the Islamic law, the term means successors of the Prophet of Islam. So when the Prophet ﷺ passed away in the year 632 CE, he left behind successors like Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, and the list goes on, right? So the first caliphs were basically four caliphs, or five rightly guided caliphs, if you want to include Hassan radiallahu anh as well, because he had 6 months of caliphate when he ruled. And then caliphate, or the institution, was handed over to Muawiyah radiallahu anh, and thenceforth a new dynasty was formed, and that dynasty is known as the Umayyad Caliphate, or the Umayyad dynasty of Islam. The first ruler of the Umayyad dynasty was Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, who was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the last caliph of that particular dynasty was Marwan. Okay, Marwan basically was the last caliph, and he lost his power in the year 132. It corresponds to approximately 750 CE. This is when the Abbasids came to power. So this was the end of the Umayyad Caliphate, or the first Umayyad Caliphate, right? So this was a dynasty which was formed after the rightly guided caliphs had ended their approximately 30 years of reign, right? So I'm talking about Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, and Hassan radiallahu anhum ajma'in. And then came Muawiyah, and then started the Umayyad dynasty. Now, this was the first Umayyad dynasty that went on from the year 60 Hijri to 132 Hijri. Okay, so this was the first Umayyad dynasty. Now, there was a second Umayyad dynasty, or the second Umayyad Caliphate, you can say, right? And that was established in Spain. Now, why that happened is a very interesting question and requires a very interesting answer as well. I'll give you a brief summary of the background. When the Abbasid Revolution started in the Muslim lands, it started from the east, current-day Persia, Khorasan region, and some parts of Central Asia today, Samarkand and Bukhara. This was the Abbasid support hub. While in the west, the Umayyads basically held sway. They were very powerful, very influential, and the city of Damascus was the Umayyad capital, right? So when the Abbasids came to power, they carried out massacres of the Umayyads and the Umayyad royal families, right? So many Umayyad princes escaped. So one of the grandsons of one of the Umayyad caliphs called Hisham bin Abdul Malik, who ruled from 105 to 125. This was a very powerful Umayyad caliph. He ruled for nearly 20 years. One of his grandsons was Abdurrahman I. Abdurrahman I is given the title the first is because he initiated a new dynasty in Spain. Now, Spain, the territory of Spain was taken by the Muslims in the year 92 Hijri. That corresponds to the year 711 CE. Okay, in the year 711 CE, early 8th century, the Muslims took the land of Spain. In the same year, Muslims took some parts of northern China and also some parts of India in the province of Sindh, current-day Pakistan. So the Muslim expansion was at its peak. This was the Umayyad period, and the largest empire world had ever known to date was the Umayyad Empire. Even Alexander the Great and the territory taken by him wasn't as large as what the Umayyads had achieved in little time. So Umayyads were ruling a dynasty that stretched from China to Spain and all the way up to India. So in 711 CE, Tariq bin Ziyad, a Muslim leader, landed in Spain at Gibraltar and then made his way to mainland Spain. He had a decisive battle against the King Roderick, the Visigothic King Roderick, who came with 100,000 men, and Tariq bin Ziyad led a contingent of nearly 12,000 people that consisted of 5,000 Arabs and 7,000 Berbers from North Africa. And thenceforth, the Muslims had established a rule in Spain, and some turmoil followed soon after because of the turmoil at the center in Damascus when the Umayyads were removed from power by the Abbasids. So Spain went into a political turmoil. There was chaos, political chaos for nearly 40 years. Then came Abdurrahman I, who basically was, you can say, a fugitive prince. He was from the Umayyad royal family. He escaped from Damascus, made his way all the way to Spain, and it took him actually a few years to reach Spain. And in Spain, he established his own rule, representing his Umayyad ancestors, right? When he arrived in Spain, the Arabs and the Berbers in Spain were already in conflict with each other. There was lack of unity in Spain. So when they saw a royal prince arriving in Spain at this time, they found an opportunity to unite everyone under his leadership. So just bear with me 1 second. So the leadership of Abdurrahman I was welcomed. The Arabs and the Berbers and the other tribes who were ruling Spain at the time, they found an opportunity in the leadership of Abdurrahman I. They saw him as a potential leader who could unite everyone, all the Muslims in Spain. And Abdurrahman I, he did that. And amazingly, he was able to unite all the factions within Spain, whatever part, Spain pretty much, you can say 70% of Spain was taken by the Arabs and the Berbers within 4 to 5 years initially. And then later on, this occupation of Spain or the Iberian Peninsula was maintained by them. And then a government was announced under Abdurrahman I. Cordoba, the city of Cordoba, became the capital. Thenceforth, the dynasty came to be known as the Emirate of Cordoba. It came to be known as the Emirate of Cordoba, which basically was an emirate. These rulers were called emirs. So Abdurrahman I and his descendants, his immediate descendants, they ruled Cordoba or ruled from Cordoba for the next almost, you can say, 300 years, right? For nearly 300 years, Abdurrahman I and his descendants ruled. From the mid-8th century to nearly the mid-11th century, these people, this family, the Umayyad family, ruled Cordoba or ruled from Cordoba, much of Spain. And initially, this state or this dynasty was called the Emirate of Cordoba. Later on, in the 10th century, to be precise, in the year 929, one of the descendants of Abdurrahman I, called Abdurrahman III, announced himself to be the Caliph of Cordoba. So basically, he announced his caliphate ruling from Cordoba. And this was done due to a geopolitical challenge that came from the Fatimids of Egypt. Now, those of you who know the history of Islam in this period, you would know that Fatimids were a Shia group who claimed to be the descendants of Fatima radiallahu anha. They were proto-Ismaili, you can say, and they somehow managed to get hold of Egypt, and they ruled much of North Africa. North Africa, most of it became a Fatimid territory, vis-a-vis the territory of the Abbasids ruling from Baghdad, and much of the Middle East was under the Abbasids. But North Africa was under the sway or the influence of the Fatimids. Now, this was a direct threat to the Emirate of Cordoba in Spain. So that's why, to strengthen his claim on the throne and to legitimize his authority, Abdurrahman III, one of the descendants of Abdurrahman I, announced his caliphate, and he became the Caliph of Cordoba. And while previously the emirs of Cordoba recognized the superiority of the Abbasids in Baghdad, they felt the need now to announce their own caliphate because the Abbasids could no longer protect them against the Fatimids. So they felt that they should announce their caliphate, they should announce their own caliphate to legitimize their rule and independently confront the Fatimids and do away with their forever increasing influence in North Africa. As you can imagine, North Africa was very close to Spain and is close to Spain. It was very close to the Umayyad territory. So for that reason, Umayyads or the Caliphate of Cordoba invaded the territory of Spain. Sorry, not Spain. North Africa a number of times to deal with the threat of the Fatimids that came from North Africa. So for this reason, Abdurrahman III planned invasions of the Fatimid territory, right? He secured Melilla in 927 in North Africa, in current-day Morocco, Ceuta, another city, in 931 CE, and Tangier in 951. Okay, so this Abdurrahman III did to establish his rule in Cordoba, right? So to summarize all of this, the Emirate of Cordoba became the Caliphate of Cordoba in the 10th century. Many people think that the Caliphate of Cordoba was called the Caliphate or the Khilafah of Cordoba from the very start. That's a misconception. Initially, it was called the Emirate of Cordoba. Later on, in the 10th century, to be precise, in the year 929, when Abdurrahman III announced himself to be a caliph, the Umayyad Caliph of Cordoba. And this is why this dynasty or that particular political entity is referred to as the second caliphate, the second Umayyad Caliphate, which is also called the Caliphate of Cordoba. So this is a very brief summary of the political history of the Umayyad dynasty of Cordoba. Later on, unfortunately, nearly a century after Abdurrahman III announced his caliphate, the caliphate fell. Okay, this was due to infighting, again, divisions within the Muslim ranks. And in 1031 CE, the last Umayyad Caliph died, and thenceforth, the rule of Muslims in Spain split into many petty states. And this period is referred to as Muluk al-Tawaif. Muluk al-Tawaif means kings of petty states or kings of princely dynasties. So many different dynasties came about as a result of the fall of the center or the fall of power from Cordoba or in Cordoba, right? So when Umayyad institution or the caliphate fell in 1031 CE, when Imam Ibn Hazm was alive. Ibn Hazm is a great scholar of Islam. He saw all of this decline with his own eyes, and he was one of the loyalists. In other words, he actually favored the continuation of the institution of caliphate to keep the Muslims together as one united bunch. But obviously his views were not followed, and the caliphate fell in 1031, and then followed a period of division, turmoil, and chaos. And soon after, kingdoms from the north, Christian Catholic kingdoms from the north, they started what they call Reconquista. Reconquista, literally, as the word speaks for itself, means reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslim rule, right? Muslims had come to Spain in the year 711, and by 1031, Muslims were the most powerful entity, political entity in Spain when the caliphate fell. And after the caliphate fell, many small principalities came about as a result. And the Christians, because of this division, the Catholic Church or the Catholic monarchs from the north, but territories like Aragon and Castile, they saw the opportunity to take back some of the land from the Muslims due to this break in their unity. And that's why Christian princes and kings started to take the territory back from the Muslims. So in 1066, Muslims lost the city of Bobastro. Okay, then in 1085, the city of Toledo, which was a very important hub for the Muslims in Spain, was taken. Toledo was the ancient capital of Spain, which held a lot of significance, historic significance for the Christians of Spain. So they took the city from the Muslims in 1085. And then, of course, for some time, this advance was checked by another group of people who came from North Africa, also known as Al-Murabitun. Al-Muravids, also known as Al-Murabitun, right? So Al-Murabitun came, led by a man called Yusuf Tashfin. He drove back the Christian kings, and Muslims were to remain in power in central Spain and southern Spain for another nearly 200 years, until the Almohads, also known as Al-Mawahidun, which was another dynasty that came from North Africa, from current-day Morocco, which ousted the Al-Muravid or Al-Murabitun dynasty, and they came to power. In 1204, there was a decisive battle that took place in northern Spain, and Muslims lost this battle. As a result, Muslims lost the remaining cities or powerhouses in central Spain, such as Valencia, Seville, and Cordoba. The city of Cordoba and the city of Valencia and Seville fell very close to each other, chronologically speaking, and Muslims lost much of their power in central Spain in the 13th century. By 1250s, Muslims had lost almost all of the major political centers. No one could imagine in the 10th century, when Abdurrahman III was ruling Spain from Cordoba, no one could imagine that Muslims will one day lose all of this territory to Catholics or Christians coming from the north to reclaim this territory from the Muslims. By the way, most Muslims in Spain by now were ethnically Spaniards. They were not necessarily Arabs and Berbers. The Arabs always remained a minority in Spain with the Jewish community. The Arabs were basically in numbers. They were as many as the Jewish people. Berbers slightly outnumbered the Arabs and the Jews. And majority of the Muslims in Spain were, by the 11th century, when the Umayyad Caliphate fell, were native Spaniards. They were Hispanic. They were not basically Arabs or Berbers, as many people claim. So the majority of the Muslims, by the time Muslims lost all of the territory of Spain, later on, majority of the Muslims were actually Hispanic. They were native Spanish people, right? And why was that the case? This is another question which I will address very soon in due course. Why were these conversions taking place under the Muslim rule? As far as the Spanish population was concerned, we will discuss that in due course very quickly, inshallah ta'ala. So after Muslims lost this territory in central Spain, some of the major capitals of the Muslim power in Spain, what remained was the state of Granada, the Nasrid state of Granada in the south. From 1250s to 1492, the Nasrids held the territory of Granada against attacks from the Christians from the north, right? And the final attack came in 1492, the very year when Christopher Columbus allegedly discovered America, even though America was already there, but he discovered it somehow. And that was the year when the Muslims of Spain lost their final stronghold in that territory. And that was the city of Granada, which fell to two monarchs called Ferdinand and Isabella. Okay, the states of Castile and Aragon were united by marriage, and these two monarchs, they married each other and they united their powers. And the first target they had was to conquer or reconquer the state of Granada from the Muslims, and that happened in 1492. So from 711 CE to 1492, Muslims ruled much of Iberian Peninsula, and Muslims ruled parts of Spain at times. For the first 300 years, most of Spain was ruled by the Muslims under the Umayyad Emirate and then Caliphate. And after the Umayyad Caliphate fell, for the next nearly 450 years, Muslims held territories of Spain. Basically, although the territories kept decreasing in its size because of the reconquest of Christian kings from the north, Eventually, Muslims lost all that territory in 1492, and Spain became a fully Christian principality or a Christian country after having been ruled for nearly 700 years by Muslims. Okay, and then soon after, the Muslims were exiled to North Africa. For one more century, Muslims remained in Spain under heavy persecution from the Catholic Church and the institution of Inquisition. Muslims were facing extinction at the hands of the institution of Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. This was a notorious institution that was torturing people, that was forcing people into Christianity. People were given the choice of either get baptized or die. Many Jews and Muslims pretended to be Christians to save their lives, and they remained Jews and Muslims in secret. And this was well known to the Spanish government. And eventually, in 1609, under the rule of Philip III, much of this population of the Jews and the Muslims, who were also called the Moriscos, was exiled, banished from the land of Spain, because the Spanish government was, feeling threatened by the Ottomans and the Ottoman advance. So they saw Muslims as the fifth column, and the Muslims were basically exiled under brutal circumstances in the year 1603. This history is very, very painful. It is very difficult to describe in such a short span of time. And I strongly recommend some books for all of you to consult. One of them is Moorish Spain by Richard Fletcher. It is a very good introduction of Islamic Spain. The book is titled Moorish Spain. Also, there is another book by Anwar Shahna. Anwar is spelled Anwar. Shahna is spelled Chejne. Shahna. And the title of the book is Muslim Spain. Okay, the history of Muslim Spain. Muslim Spain by Anwar Shahna. Another book I strongly recommend on the history of Spain, Muslim Spain, is titled The Legacy of Muslim Spain. The Legacy of Muslim Spain. It has been published by the Routledge Press or the Routledge Press, depending on how you pronounce it. You are Canadian, so I'm assuming that you would pronounce it as Routledge, not Routledge. We British, us British, we pronounce it as Routledge. Okay, Routledge publishers, they have published a book titled The Legacy of Muslim Spain, and the editor is Salma Khadra Jayusi, and it is an academic collection of articles on the history of Muslim Spain, a fascinating work. So if you want to get glimpses into the history of Islam and Muslims in Spain for this period, in particular the Caliphate of Cordoba, then you must look into these books for an idea, inshallah. And also another very powerful book by a 19th century Orientalist. His name was Reinhard Dozy. His name is spelled Reinardt, Reinhard Dozy, Dozy. So if you put in Google Dozy, Dozy, Muslim Spain, you will get his history of Islamic Spain. That's a very good book as well. It's a good treatment of the history of Muslims in Spain. So these are some of the books you can consult on details of what I have already presented. In a short lecture like this, I can only give you glimpses into the history of Islamic Spain. So now to the achievements of Islamic Spain very quickly, having described very briefly the political history of Muslim Spain, in particular the Caliphate of Cordoba, and I can address more if you want to ask questions during Q&A. One period I quickly passed through is the period of Muluk al-Tawaif, or the period of petty kingdoms in Spain. These petty kingdoms are basically Muslim kingdoms that came about as a result of the decline of the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba. So for that, of course, you will have to read the histories I've already recommended. There are detailed studies of these petty kingdoms if you are interested in any one of them, right? So with regards to cultural prosperity of Spain, Muslim Spain was very, very powerful. During the reign of Abdurrahman III, it was the most powerful country in Western Europe. I repeat that. Okay, in the 10th century, Muslim Spain was the most powerful state in Western Europe, more than Germany, France, Italy, Britain put together. Okay, Germany, France, Italy, and Britain were the backwater of the world. These territories were known as dark lands or barbaric lands. People in these lands were not as civilized as they became later on. I mean, there was some activity there. There was still art and culture prevalent in these lands, no doubt. We can't deny that. I mean, if you look at Anglo-Saxon period in Britain, it was very, very, very interesting. Very, how can I put it, impressive when it comes to art. If you look at Anglo-Saxon art, it is absolutely amazing. So, there was a civilization in these lands, but not to the same extent as what we found in Cordoba. Cordoba was the largest city in the world with a population of 1 million people. Okay, at one point in the 10th century, a German nun called Hrothgar, she visited the city of Cordoba and she called the city an ornament of the world. She said, this city is the ornament of the world. She was so baffled and taken aback and fascinated by what she saw in Cordoba. She called it the ornament of the world in one of her writings, right? So Cordoba was absolutely fascinating. You can say the modern equivalent would be something like maybe New York, London, Paris. Cordoba was as large, as cosmopolitan as that in the 10th century. So from the year 900 to the year 1000, this century, this 100-year period was the most prosperous and the most, how can I put it, influential period in the history of Islamic Spain. It was in this period when the Jews, flourished. The Jewish people in general called this period, or at least 300 years between the year 900 to 1200, the Jewish people refer to this age as the Golden Age of the House of Israel. This is when the Jewish people flourished in Spain as a community. In fact, one of the Jewish historians from the US, his name is Zion Zohar, he has written a book titled The History of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewry. He states that born during this period of Golden Age were some of the most influential personalities in Jewish history. For example, Judah Halevi, who was a poet, Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who was the prime minister of the Caliph in the mid-10th century. The prime minister of the Muslim Caliphate of Cordoba was a Jewish man called Hasdai ibn Shaprut, one of the most powerful Jewish men in the world at the time. He was the most powerful vizier or prime minister to the most powerful monarch in Western Europe, and that made him the most powerful Jewish man in the world. He wrote letters to the scholars of Baghdad who were practicing law in Baghdad under the Abbasid rule. He wrote letters to them asking them if they need anything, if they need any support. I'm in a powerful position in Spain, in Cordoba. I am serving as the vizier or as the prime minister to the most powerful king in the world, in his view. And he reached out to Jewish communities even as far as Khazaria. He wrote a letter to the Khazar Jews asking them if they are the lost 13th tribe. Okay, those lost 10 tribes of Israel. I mean, 10 tribes of Israel, sorry, not 12. If we go back in history, we know that 10 tribes of Israel were attacked by the Assyrians in the 8th century BC, and they disappeared from history. So Hasdai ibn Shaprut, being a Jewish scholar, a Jewish historian, a Jewish theologian, a physician, he wrote letters to the Khazar Jewish community in Khazaria, okay, near current-day Georgia, okay, and he was asking them if they are part of those lost 10 tribes. So this shows that the Jewish people were flourishing for these 300 years, if not more, and this was the golden age for the Jewish people. As for the Christians, they also flourished. Those Christians who lived in peace were never, persecuted. There was no religious persecution in Spain. Generally speaking, of course, there were periods of turmoil. There were periods of disturbances due to wars and other reasons. But generally speaking, throughout the Muslim rule in Spain, the Jewish and the Christian people lived side by side in peace with the Muslims, right? There was a period of disturbance for nearly 10 years in the 9th century between 850 to 859 CE, when the Emirate of Cordoba was, of course, in power. It wasn't yet a caliphate. It wasn't yet a caliphate. It was still an emirate. In the mid-9th century, from 850 to 859, there was a movement launched by some Christian extremists in Spain, and this movement was called the Martyrs of Cordoba. Why was this movement launched in the city of Cordoba is a very interesting point. We read in the writings from that very period that during this period, hundreds of thousands of Christians in Spain were converting to Islam. They were so influenced by Muslim literature, Muslim philosophy, Muslim civilization in general. They saw the advancement in science, in culture, in philosophy, in education. Muslims are very civilized, very polite culture of Islam. They were heavily influenced by it. And when these Christian youngsters looked at the Christian states of the north, they felt inferior. They felt ashamed of their Christian identity, and the result was their indulgence in Muslim philosophy and Muslim literature. And one of the outcomes was outright conversion to Islam. So one of the authors from the 9th century, mid-9th century, Cordoba, his name was Paul Alvarez. Paul Alvarez writes that Christian youngsters today, they don't read Latin commentaries. They don't read Latin church fathers. They don't read the writings of Christian scholars anymore. Rather, they are studying Arabic works written by Arabs. And these Christians have become so good in the Arabic language that they can pronounce better poetry in the Arabic language than the Arabs can in Cordoba. And one of the outcomes is that they are converting to Islam. And therefore, something has to be done. And something was done. An attempt was made to stop this rapid conversion to Islam on the part of the Christian masses of Cordoba in particular, and the rest of the Iberian Peninsula in general, because Islam was a very powerful civilization. Muslims presented a very, very, very powerful alternative to Christianity, and many Christians were accepting Islam. So from 850 to 859, a movement was launched by a bunch of Christian extremists in Cordoba. This movement was called the Martyrs of Cordoba. Why were they called martyrs? Because they came up with an idea to stop the rapid conversion of Christians to Islam. So what they did was they would go to the Muslim public areas and they would insult the Prophet of Islam. They would shout insults against the Prophet of Islam. They would insult Islam. They would insult Muslims. They would insult the Prophet of Islam. They would, throw abuse at the Prophet, and the Muslims would get angry and arrest them and take them to court. In the court, the judges, the qadis, would ask them to retract, and they would refuse to retract. So the punishment, the capital punishment, would be applied on them. They did this to gain sympathy from the Christians. Because they couldn't convince the Christian youngsters and masses when it comes to their religion and their philosophy, they found this radical idea to stop the spread of Islam and the conversion to Islam on the part of the Christians. So they would go to courthouses, they would insult the Prophet of Islam. As a result, they would be punished through capital punishment, which was applied in Spain at the time. Okay, it wasn't allowed by law to insult God and prophets of God in Spain because it was ruled by the law of Islam. So many of these people were executed as a result. Okay, and this movement went on to own these extremists. They said, we have nothing to do with these extremists. We are perfectly fine. We're living with the Muslims in harmony. These bunch of extremists are actually causing problems, and they are disturbing the peace. So we have nothing to do with them. That's why this movement didn't last very long, because it didn't find any Christian support. Christians disowned this movement. So it only lasted for nearly 10 years. And a very powerful book, a very interesting book, a very good book has been authored by Jessica A. Coop on this very episode of the history of Islamic Spain. Jessica A. Coop have published a book titled The Martyrs of Cordoba. The Martyrs of Cordoba. I strongly recommend this book for everyone who is listening to this. Inshallah, you will be fascinated by this particular episode. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this so that you realize how powerful the civilization of Islam was in Islamic Spain, right? During this period of Muslim rule, in particular, the Emirate of Cordoba, and then later on the Caliphate of Cordoba, many books were collected by Muslim rulers themselves, right? Many Muslim rulers were scholars par excellence, right? They were absolutely fascinated by some of the works produced in places like Baghdad and other uh, Muslim centers of learning. And I want to very quickly give you some details on this matter so that you can actually understand where I'm coming from. So, for example, if we look at some of the examples of Muslim rulers of Spain, what was the revolution of Spain when it comes to literature and literacy and all the intellectual pastimes of the Muslims, right? There is a very powerful contrast drawn between Muslim Spain and Western Europe at the time by a scholar called Victor Robinson in his book, History of Medicine. It was published in New York. In 1936 on page 164. Victor Robinson, in his book, The Story of Medicine, states, and this is a very eloquent contrast between the two civilizations. Europe was, and I quote, Europe was darkened at sunset. Cordoba shone with public lamps. Europe was dirty. Cordoba built 1,000 public baths. Europe was covered with vermin. Cordoba changed its undergarments daily. Europe lay in mud. Cordoba's streets were paved. Europe's palaces had smoke holes in the ceiling. Cordoba's arabesques were exquisite. Europe's nobility could not sign its name. Cordoba's children went to school. Europe's monks could not read the baptismal service. Cordoba's teachers created a library of Alexandrian magnitude. Victor Robinson, The Story of Medicine, page 164. This was an amazing contrast drawn by Victor Robinson between Muslim Cordoba and Western Europe. So during this revolution, many people were produced. This scientific revolution or revolution of education, which took place in Spain, and how it happened is also fascinating. For example, Professor Arnold, he was a historian who wrote a book titled The Preaching of Islam. In this book, he basically put down some of these ideas. On page 131, he states, Muslim Spain had written one of the brightest pages in the history of medieval Europe. Her influence had passed through Provence into other countries of Europe, bringing into birth a new poetry and a new culture. And it was from her that Christian scholars received what of Greek philosophy and science they had to stimulate their mental activity up to the time of Renaissance. So in other words, Professor Thomas Arnold basically is claiming that even Renaissance was directly influenced by Muslims or Muslim works from Spain. George Saliba is a contemporary historian of science. He has published his book titled Islamic Science and the Making of the European Renaissance. The book was published by Massachusetts University Press in 2007. On page 1, George Saliba states, there is hardly a book on Islamic civilization or on the general history of science that does not at least pretend to recognize the importance of the Islamic scientific tradition and the role this tradition played in the development of human civilization in general. Okay, so then there are other scholars who also paid tributes to Muslim Spain similarly in similar ways, right? So one of the things I want to very quickly share is the libraries of Cordoba that were produced during this period in Spain, right? The first library of importance and value in Europe was the Royal Library of the Umayyads in Cordoba. Okay, Abdurrahman I, who ruled from 756 to 788, was himself a scholar and a poet. His son Hisham the First, who ruled from 786 to 796, followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a poet and an admirer of Arabic literature. And then Hakam the First, who ruled from 796 to 826, also loved poetry and liked to be surrounded by scholars. The later caliphs, especially Abdurrahman III, who ruled from 912 to 961, and Hakam II, who ruled from 961 to 1008, were devoted to hobby of collecting rare books. Abbas bin Nasir, the agent of Abdurrahman III, traveled as far as Mesopotamia, which is Iraq, in search of Arabic translations of Persian and Greek works on science. Rare and valuable books, old and new, were bought and copied from Hakam II in Alexandria, Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus. The chief librarian of Hakam II was a high-ranking eunuch called Talid, according to whom there were 400,000 volumes of books in the royal library. The list of the books recording the names of the authors and the titles alone consisted of 44 volumes of 50 folios each. Now, this is absolutely fascinating and mind-blowing. Okay, so what are we told here? We are told that there were 400,000 volumes, handwritten manuscripts, because there were no printing presses at the time in the 10th century. There was no printing press around in the world in the 10th century when Caliph Hakam II, ruling from Cordoba in Spain, had a collection of 400,000 volumes in his library. This is absolutely amazing, absolutely fascinating, right? And this was possibly the largest library in the world. Hakam II was absolutely crazy about books. He would send agents, because he was a caliph, he was powerful, he had money, he had influence. He would send his agents to collect books from all around the world, going as far as China, Central Asia, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, you name it. Every single Muslim center of learning, Hakam II in the 10th century had his agents collecting books, manuscripts, getting books translated for him. Okay, this is something we have lost today, my brothers and sisters. I want to emphasize, we were the most bookly people in the world. In the world, we were the most bookly people. Today, we have become the most bookless people in the world, unfortunately. Okay, from being a bookly civilization, we have become a bookless civilization today. We need to return back to our books. We need to go back to our histories. We need to go back to our philosophy, our intellectual activity, our poets, our philosophers, our intellectuals, our scholars, our theologians, and our authors, our calligraphers, our architects. We need to go back to that so that we can revive this knowledge of Muslim civilization, which flourished most importantly in Spain and other regions. So the Muslim activity when it comes to science, technology, advancement was absolutely fascinating, to an extent that Northern Europeans, they became civilized subsequently, having read works pioneered, penned, researched, produced in Spain. Muslim Spain left behind thousands upon thousands of volumes in libraries, later on taken by Christian kings from the north. And they were blown away when they came across these libraries. For example, the Library of Toledo, the city that was taken in 1085, as mentioned earlier. The Christian kings were absolutely blown away. They realized that this is the power of the Muslims. This is why Muslims are so civilized. So they got their Christian scholars to study the Arabic language and then start translating these Arabic works into Latin. And then in the city of Toledo, a translation movement took place. And under this movement, many important works in the Arabic language on different subjects and topics were translated into Latin. And then these works were later on transferred to the rest of European territories, Germany, France, Italy, and Britain, to be precise. This is where these works were studied. For example, the University of Paris, the University of Naples, the University of Oxford. Arabic works were taught in these universities in the 11th century, in the 12th century, and the 13th century. This is why many historians of science refer to a 12th century Renaissance. There was a 15th century Renaissance in Italy, no doubt in Florence, okay, but there was a 12th century Renaissance which was based upon entirely on the works of the Muslims. And you can read a book on this titled The 12th Century Renaissance by Haskins. Haskins is an author who has written a book on this very topic titled The 12th Century Renaissance, and the author is Haskins, okay? Haskins, right? So this was an intellectual activity that influenced Northern Europe and the rest of Europe, and whatever came about of the European Renaissance later on was in a huge way a legacy of the Muslims in Spain, or Muslim Spain for that matter, right? So you cannot imagine the European Renaissance without the works produced in Muslim Spain in the Arabic language, okay? And this was, of course, coming from the top. The Caliphate, the institution of Caliphate, was directly involved in promoting education for all the people, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, without any discrimination. So all the people were going through these books, and there were 70 public libraries in the 10th century in Cordoba. Can you imagine, when books were so precious, there were 70 public libraries in the city of Cordoba. Anyone could walk in and start teaching from those books and start learning from those books. This was a society built upon knowledge, literature, book, and that's why the Muslim history of Spain is so powerful, it's so fascinating, so important for us to learn about, right? Because this was the history that influenced the making of the world later on, okay? You cannot imagine the Western civilization without the civilization in Spain, the Muslim civilization in Spain in particular. You cannot imagine the Western civilization in many, many forms. You know, the knowledge of algebra, the knowledge of, for example, alchemy, which is later on called chemistry, right? The knowledge of anatomy, the knowledge of medicine, the knowledge of philosophy, the philosophy or the commentaries of Ibn Rushd, the famous scholar Ibn Rushd from Spain. His commentaries were studied in the city of Cordoba later on under the the supervision of European scholars in universities like Paris. Thomas Aquinas, a Catholic theologian from France in Paris, right? He was alive in the 13th century. He was directly influenced by the writings of Ibn Rushd from Spain. So this was the influence Muslim Spain exerted or experienced over the European or Western European civilization. So this is the role the Muslim civilization played when it comes to the making of the Western civilization from Islam. That's why the books I have recommended are absolutely crucial for you to study, right? There is another book I would finally like to recommend before I end this session, because I've been going on for nearly an hour. So inshallah, I will take some questions as well. We will move on to Q&A. This book I want to recommend very quickly is Hidden Debt to the Muslim Civilization. Hidden Debt to the Islamic Civilization by Salahuddin Al-Jazairi. Hidden Debt to the Islamic Civilization. Please Google this title. You'll get the book I'm talking about. It is absolutely filled with fascinating information on the Muslim civilization from Spain in particular, and of course other lands, and how this civilization or these civilizations influenced what became later on the Western civilization. I could go on about art and culture and literature and the achievements of Muslim Spain in military prowess and the making of Madinatul Zahra in the 10th century, when Abdurrahman III, when he declared his caliphate in 929, he immediately started building a city called Madinatul Zahra, which is a masterpiece, and the Mosque of Cordoba. It is an absolute masterpiece. I can go on and talk about economy and religion and religious issues, but time does not permit me to do that. So I have already referred, referenced books. So please do read those books for details if you want to be more aware of Muslim Spain and the Caliphate of Cordoba. On that note, I will stop there. Thank you so much for listening to me. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And we can open the floor to questions, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair for this presentation. Like Brother Adnan said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourselves or just pop your question in the chat. Don't feel shy.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair, brother. I just had a question about the you said the switch from the Emirate of Cordoba to the Caliphate of Cordoba. What's the significance of, switching the is it just that now there's a leader being identified as a caliph? Like, what was the significance of that switch?
Significance of that switch was purely political in nature, because there was a political threat from the Fatimids in North Africa. The Fatimids were expanding their territory, and the Emirate of Cordoba felt threatened by this expansion in North Africa, and they knew that the Fatimids had their eyes on Spain, because Spain was very rich. The Muslim Spain was very powerful and very rich. So before the Fatimids could arrive in Spain, the Emirate of Cordoba, or the Muslim rule in Spain, wanted to preempt the Fatimid advance in North Africa. So one of the ways to do that was to launch a jihad against the Fatimids, right? And that could only be done by the Caliph. So this was one of the reasons, one of the incentives as to why Abdurrahman III declared himself to be the Caliph, because the Abbasids were simply powerless. They were not able to defend the Muslims of Spain against the Fatimid advance anymore. So Fatimids were basically not Sunnis. They were hostile to the Sunni government of Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate, and they were also hostile towards the Sunni Emirate of Cordoba. That's why Abdurrahman III, as a point of convenience, announced himself to be Caliph, and to legitimize his rule and his campaigns and his military expansion, he declared himself to be a Caliph. So that's where the significance is. Significance is basically now declaring himself Caliph means that he is the ruler of the Muslims now, not only the ruler of Spain or the Emir of Cordoba, he is now the Caliph of the Muslims. So any Muslims who want to take refuge with him or come and live in his state under his protection, they are allowed to do so, because he is the father figure now. He's the successor of the Prophet on land, on earth. So this is the point. This is where the difference is. An Emir is simply a local Emir, a local dynasty, a local entity. A Caliph is basically pan-Islamic. A Caliph, his influence, basically reaches as far as possible, as far as the Muslim lands, stretch. So this is the significance. That's why he declared, as a clever move, as a very genius move on his part, to legitimize his rule and to gain support from the Muslims, even in North Africa. So if there are Sunni Muslims in North Africa, which was the case, because the Fatimids were in a minority. So when the Sunni Muslims saw that the Caliph is now in Cordoba, the Fatimids found it very difficult to maintain their rule over North Africa, especially when the majority of the people were Sunni under their rule. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, next question, please. I cannot read the chat, so if someone can read the chat and put the questions to me, that'll be appreciated, inshallah. Are there any more questions in the chat, or let me see if I can read the chat. Messages, chat, right. Okay. So there are no questions in the chat as far as I can see.
Sorry, brother, if I could jump in with one more question. This one's a little bit more general, but in trying to learn, study and read about Islamic history, one thing that I found is really difficult is when you're trying to learn or study in English, a lot of the writers are obviously like English, like Westerners or like Orientalists or anything of that nature. So would you say that, to avoid Western, like English, like European writers, or no?
That's a misconception.
Okay.
To think that all Western historians are biased and prejudiced and are a bunch of spin doctors and liars, this is a very big exception. No, there are many good historians, objective historians. In fact, the majority are good. Okay, and if you read books written by them, highly academic, of course they are not Muslims. They're not gonna write as a Muslim believer. Okay, they are not theologians. They are simply historians. They write history from their Western lens, a Western perspective, and albeit from a secular perspective. What you need to do is you put the secularism aside, you put the Western bias aside, which is natural. It is but natural for everyone to be biased when we are writing. We have a lens, we have a particular lens we read from and write through, right? So we put that bias aside and we take the information. There's a lot of good information in these histories. So not all Western historians are biased and prejudiced and a bunch of liars. No, there are many, many good historians. And when books are recommended, then you follow those books and read those books. And no book is perfect, by the way. Yeah, you might find problems, you might find opinions that are disturbing. Ignore those opinions and focus on the information, building your knowledge of your own civilization. And then you can write your own books. You can produce your own scholars. You can do your own PhDs and start writing books, start correcting histories, start correcting biases and prejudices. So the best way to do these things is to start reading and not have this mindset or this attitude that, oh, all of these guys are our enemies and they are all biased. They will never present our faith and our civilization accurately. This is a misconception. So you'll find a lot of good information in the books. You don't have to follow everything, but be wary that you can find a lot of good information in the books I've already recommended. And there are a lot more books you can study. So once you read around, you get an idea as to who is who, right? But you need to read, you need to focus, you need to find your focus in history, start reading on it, and you'll become a master of that field. Before you know, you won't be affected by any biases and prejudices, inshallah. So the solution is we have to excel. We have to become masters of our own history. We have to own our own history. We have to study it, right? We can't ignore it and neglect it anymore. Okay, we can't leave it to others to study and teach it to us. And that's where we get problems, because we are not teaching our own history. So we need to start learning our history. We need to start doing PhDs and masters in our own history and start teaching. And inshallah, you will see the difference. You will see a change very soon. If there are no more questions, then we will end the session, inshallah.
Brother, I believe there is one more question. So somebody has asked in the chat, so the switch of the Umayyad dynasty from Kufa to Spain, was this after Imam Shafi and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, or was this during their lifetime? Because in the lifetime of Imam Abu Hanifa, I believe there was a rebellions going on to the Umayyads.
Imam Abu Hanifa died in 150 Hijri, and the Abbasids came to power in 132. And the rest of the Imams were basically all, they were all born and died, apart from Imam Malik. Imam Malik was born during the Umayyad rule and died in the Abbasid rule. But Imam Ahmad and Imam Shafi were both born during the Abbasid period. And Imam Shafi was born in Egypt, Gaza, in Palestine. And Imam Ahmad was born in Iraq, if I'm not mistaken. He was Shaybani. Shayban was an Iraqi Arab tribe. So Imam Ahmad and Hanbal was born during the Abbasid period. So the Caliphate of Cordoba, or the Emirate of Cordoba was already established within the lives of Imam Ahmad and Imam Shafi'i. But the Caliphate was, of course, declared later on in 929 CE in the 10th century. One of the descendants of Abdurrahman I, who was Abdurrahman III, he declared himself to be the Caliph. Prior to him, it was simply called the Emirate of Cordoba. Okay, I hope that answers the question, inshallah.
Yes, Jazakallah khair. I don't think there are any other questions. So with that being said, I think we can conclude this event, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك جزاك الله خيرا وبارك الله فيك.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Allah bless you, and my honor to be with you. Thank you so much.
It was our honor. Jazakallah khair.
Always welcome. We can do it in the future again, inshallah, on a different topic.
Inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.